all of these factors are moving through the economy, both locally and globally. And it's making it, I think, a lot tougher for businesses to operate in terms of the operating environment. So I wondered whether you could share with us what advice you'd give to businesses in terms of, new businesses that are starting up or businesses that are here today, in terms of how to manage risk and stay resilient in this sort of uncertain environment.
That's a really good question. Like, as you would know, the previous Reserve Bank always was preemptive in their movements. The current Reserve Bank is, whatever the data said yesterday, that's the decision we're going to make tomorrow. And I think the reasons you just explained so well to everybody, or the incidents that you just explained so well to everybody in terms of uncertainty, the uncertain indicators out there, actually also applies to business. So maybe a good place to start is that, and what we do is we just play what's in front of us. It's actually quite a big help knowing that the Reserve Bank won't make calls in terms of us setting our pricing. It's a big help for us to know the Reserve Bank's only acting on data, because we know the data the same day they know the data. So, as you know, we all get the data the same day. So we can make a call. We know if
it's still interpreted differently.
But it's so, we might interpret it a bit differently, but there won't be too much. If it's 3.8, we know what's not going to happen. They're not going to put rates down. They might not put rates up, but they won't put it down. So we play what's in front of us, just like the Reserve Bank's saying. That they'll say, there's too much going on. That's what I think they're saying. There's too many changes out there. There's too much variability out there. There's too many influences into what happens in Australia relative to US trade wars, geopolitical issues, etc. And as AI is another one. Let's just play what's in front of us. And I say to business owners, they say to me, this could happen. I said, just play what's in front of you now. Sure, you can have a 5-year plan, you can have a 3-year plan, a 2-year plan. They're goals. They're more goals. You've got to be prepared more than ever before to change course and change direction. But every single day, assume that you're going to make a goal unless something is totally out of kilter. But at the same time, you can only make decisions about what you can control, and that is only what's in front of you at the time. I'm not into thinking about what might happen down the track, because these days anything could happen. I was talking about Moore's Law the other day. Moore's Law being that transistors, as they were, transistors, everything doubles, the speed of transistors doubles every 2 years. Moore's Law is no longer a law. Things change now within 2 months or a month. Politics, the USA, look what, no one would have thought Trump was going to do what he did immediately that he got elected. The sort of economic things that he did, all those initiatives, it was amazing. So I say to business owners, just play what's in front of you. Try to keep it simple. Be data-based if you can, less speculative. Be data-based, and try not to let things that you don't control run your business.
Yeah, that's great advice. I guess with Donald Trump, we had a version of him when he was the first time in presidency, and we knew that we were probably in store for some trade tensions. But you're spot on, no one could have picked the velocity and frequency of announcements, not just at the country level, but at the sector level and the company specific level, which is still ongoing. There's no country deal yet in place with China. And I think with the Reserve Bank, if you go back 6 months ago, they debated whether to cut by 50 basis points or whether to cut by 25 basis points. And you move forward to now, and they didn't even discuss a rate cut or a rate hike. But there are some analysts, obviously, that think there might be a rate hike, and I know you seem to be in that bucket. Some that are on hold, and some that are thinking about multiple rate cuts. So there's a real diversion out there among economists.
Confusion.
Well, I think they're on hold for much the same reasons that you articulated, which, underlying inflation's moved above the band, it's going to keep moving above the band, and on their very own forecast, it's not going to go back to the target band to the second half of next year. So their hands are tied unless some of those price pressures are temporary, but some of them do look quite persistent. And as you said, public spending's quite high.
I'd be interested to know, this sort of as a conversation with you, having an opportunity to ask you this question, but I'd be interested to know what your views on the various parallel economies are, because because there's obviously a cohort of people who are spending money, and there's a cohort of people who aren't. I mean, household consumption in the latest GDP numbers sort of rose, yet there are people who are still suffering from the cost of living, and I'm trying to work out who they are. And sometimes I go to the airport. When I say sometimes, I go to the airport every week, and I'm at the airport, and there is an age group of people who are travelling, and there's it's sort of abundantly clear that people over a certain age are the ones who are spending money at the moment in restaurants, etc., and travel.
I think that's spot on. I think low-income households, younger people, people with bigger mortgages, they are struggling more than at the other end, which is your older Australians who got onto the housing ladder earlier. I mean, if you have a look at what's driven house prices over the last two to three decades, you've had some structural changes that have really driven those dwelling prices, and you're not necessarily going to see them again. So if you're aged under 40 years old and you enter the housing market, you're not going to see the same sort of returns necessarily that we saw in the past, because you're not going to have that decline in nominal interest rates, so you're not going to have that change to capital gains that we had in the late 90s.
Which we all took advantage of. What would you think about this then? If I was the Treasurer and I said, Leslie, could you give me a commentary on this? I'm proposing that for every person in Australia who's under the age of 40 years of age and who doesn't own a house, instead of giving them the government guarantee to borrow up to 95%.
Yes, I don't like that.
It's the dumbest thing in the world. By the way, the regulator, the APRA today announced...
That's right, I was about to...
There's a bloody cap on how much we can lend. So, which completely competes with that. Anyway, that aside, if I said to you, what about if we give every person at the age of 40 who doesn't own a home, we reduce their tax rate to 20%? And we leave the tax rates for everybody else above 40. Every other person above 40 years of age. I mean, obviously you're going to have to... I'm making it pretty crude.
I've got Nick Hatzistakos in the room, and he's our executive chair of William Bucks, so he knows everything there is to know about tax.
No, but the rate, what about the policy rate?
Well, the only issue I'd have with that is I think it's the interaction of taxes that really matter. So I think when you move one lever, I think we have to consider what does it mean for all the other taxes, like how do they all interact with each other? And that's the thing when people say, okay, let's raise the GST to help the structural budget, which I agree with, except I think the bit that you raise the GST by has to go to the federal government, not to the states and GST revenue. Otherwise, it's not going to help the structural...
I'll give you a bit of insight on that. I said that to Jim Chalmers. So Jim was at his building where all the government people are in Bly Street there. He was sitting there and I was sitting here. And I said, hey, Jim, I said, mate, can I ask you something? He goes, yeah, what is it? He was getting up to leave anyway. And I said, why don't you... This is when they're putting the rates up, interest rates up. This is when inflation was sort of ramping. And I said, instead of putting the interest rates up, the RBA, why don't you do a deal with introduce a rule that GST can go up from 10% to 12% by 25 basis points. Every time the Reserve Bank puts up by 25 basis points, we put the GST up by 25 basis points. Every time the Reserve Bank puts it down by 25 basis points, it goes back. Never goes below 10%, never goes above 12%. And I said, that way, the whole country is feeling the pain of spending too much money. And it's funny you should say that about where the money goes, because his response is, why would I do that, Mark? Because I don't get any of that money. It all goes to the states. So maybe the point is that amount over and above the 10%
That's right.
goes to the federal.
Yeah.
Wow, I don't know the answer to that one. I wish I knew. It's a huge problem, and first one is availability of people to work on the sites. So that's more an immigration issue, because we're not going to give birth to carpenters next week, and plumbers, and we have to fix up the apprenticeship system. Most apprentices drop out after. The majority of people who start apprenticeships drop out after a short period of time because their bosses treat them like crap and they don't get paid enough. It's like if you're the plumber and you're an apprentice, you're sending him under the house doing all the crap jobs. Your electrician, you're sending him up on the roof, and there's spiders and rats. We've got to change the whole apprenticeship thing, and it's got to be something valuable. I think my grandkids, if they said to me, "Hey, Pop, what do you think I should do?" I'd say you should become a tradesperson. That's 100%. I would say that straight up. I think we've got to fix the apprenticeship system. don't know how to fix it, but we need to fix it. But there's plenty of brilliant minds down in Canberra who can work this stuff out. I think in the approval system, like when I say approval, I don't mean for loans, but approval for housing, new housing. You know, I talked to some builders down in Melbourne recently. They told me 45% of the cost base of the house that they build are taxes and imposts, like council imposts and contributions to this and contributions to that. 45%. That's crazy. I mean, I said something on Instagram the other day, it went a bit crazy, but the amount of tax that, if you looked at the amount of taxes, I sort of did a calculation. I work for 4.25 days of every 6 days a week that I work, somehow paying a state tax or a federal tax or some other impost imposed by a council, like a council rates or something like that. 4.25. That doesn't make sense. I mean, like, I feel like going to Greece where you pay no tax, as long as you get paid cash. Cash is very expensive, very important. But it's not a great thought. And you say, well, why do they need so much? Why do they have to take so much tax? Why do they need to collect so much? It's not as if they're putting it in their own pockets, you know, like they're not corrupt or anything. So there must be a spending problem. There must be, I mean, just home economics, just basic domestic economics says, if I'm spending more than I'm earning, this is the government now, and I'm running a deficit, no person in this room could do that. I've either got to go have some ability to borrow more money and keep borrowing. Well, anyone in this room would say, if any individual in this room said to another person, that's what I'm going to do for the next 10 years, I'm going to be in deficit, I'm going to just keep borrowing. You're going to say, you're off your head? Why don't we have those conversations at the round table? That's, to me, a pretty round table conversation. I said to Jim Chalmers when I did my podcast, I said, just before the election, I said, Jim, one of the things I remember about Paul Keating is that he might not be the most likeable person in the world. I mean, apart from him being extremely intelligent and like his ability to speak on his feet was brilliant, etc. Apart from all those things, he had a lot of courage. Bob Hawke had a lot of courage. John Howard had a lot of courage. Peter Costello had a lot of courage. Both sides of politics. I said to Jim, where does courage, how do you reconcile in your mind the difference between doing something courageous and doing something that you think everybody in your, I didn't say the broad church, but everybody who's voted will vote the Labor Party in wants? And like, that's a big call. And you sort of touched on it before. They've got a majority. Will they do it? Question is, how courageous are they? And I'm not suggesting they don't have courage. And I'm not saying in Aristotelian terms, you know, the golden mean for courage. I'm not saying the difference between cowardice and recklessness. I don't want it to be reckless. But I would like somewhere in between cowardice, which I'm not saying they are, and recklessness, which I know they're definitely not. Somewhere in between there, not in the middle, but somewhere in between there sits the word courage, or that sense, or that characteristics of courage, that virtue called courage, which is what we're all hanging out to see our leaders do. Hopefully we get that, and then that somehow comes back into politics and policy.
He was able to then make quite a bit of change. In particular, he did the gun laws, for example.
And the GST.
And the GST, we can't forget the GST. But, and you know, if we turn back to now, of course, the Albanese government's come in with an increased majority. No one expected that they had such an increased majority. They're almost assured of another term. They started off with that productivity roundtable, which was encouraging in terms of reforms. But then in that podcast, you and John Howard talked about the larrikin in our politicians, the larrikin that was in Bob Hawke and in Paul Keating. And I'm just wondering, do you think that we will see major reform, given that they are guaranteed a second term? Or do you think this larrikin boldness that used to be in our politicians is gone?
I think that larrikin boldness that used to be in Australia has gone. I just don't feel as though, maybe in the older generation it's the case, but I just don't feel as though it's generally accepted as good behaviour. And John Howard, even though he came across as very conservative, he had a bit of that Aussie swagger too. He's a kid from Earlwood. And then Costello was the same. And look, when Costello's had a few issues more recently, but that's sort of part of his character. Albo doesn't want to change anything, and with the greatest respect. Why would he? He wants to stay in power, because if you stay in power, you can do the things, you can do those things you want to do. You know, he has quite a strong view on his social responsibility, or his social contract with Australians. That's what I got out of my interview with him. His social contract with Australians, or those people who vote the Labor Party in, he's got a strong social contract with them. That social contract to some extent is like a really broad church. It's a lot of people, a lot of opinions, a lot of views, a lot of small groups. Therefore, bold moves, it's a bit like driving down a road with lots of turns. You're not going to put the accelerator down. You're always going to be looking to make sure that nothing's coming from this side or that side. And I think part of Albo's handicap, part of the Labor Party's handicap, is the broad church that votes them in, and therefore, whilst he may want to do something bold, they may want to change the whole tax system for all I know, but they know that they won't be able to make all the small changes because they won't be in Parliament for very long. So when I put that to Jim just dismissed me, and I thought I got a bit cross at the time. I thought, fuck you. But at the same time, I thought about it later on, and because I had to interview him about 3 weeks later, and I thought I won't hold a grudge, because really, I do believe him and the rest of the party. I'm not sure about Bowen, but I do believe most of the others, including Jim, I do think they are really do believe in their values, and I think they really are conscious of all the various groups of people that voted for them and gave him the big majority that they have. It's a different majority to what John Howard had. John Howard had one church of majority, and they're always going to back him in the two things that he put through. It's a bit more difficult with the Labor Party at the moment, because there's always going to be someone pushing back, and then there's the Greens sitting on the opposite edge, which could easily, that's like two people standing on a 100-gallon barrel of petrol with a match each, and who's going to light it first? They're both going to go up in flames. So I sort of, maybe I'm giving Albo too much leverage here, but my gut feeling is he's a good person, and my gut feeling is he truly believes in in his values, truly believes in them, and I think most of his party does too. And therefore, I would have to say he's doing a fair job. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the job that I'd want him to do, because I don't have that broad church. I have a different view on who I would vote for and how I think politically. I think more economically. I think the most important thing in a country is the standard of living. And I think the most important, and the inputs into standard of living is, do you have a roof over your head? Can you afford the cost of living? Can you afford to get your kids a piano lesson? I'm a kid who grew up in Punchbowl. My mother and father worked at a factory, my mum worked at a pub, and they managed to get me to learn piano. And I did piano right up to the age of C. I played footy. We weren't wealthy or anything, but I never missed out on anything either. I had a second-hand bike that my dad painted, but I still had the bike. I didn't know the difference, because every other kid in the street had a second-hand bike too. So that's what I call a standard of living. And for our migrants who come to this country, they want a new standard of living. I think that all gets, the base of that is the economy. And I think everything comes from that, and that's how I sort of vote, that's how I stand. I can't say to you today, honestly, that the Liberal Party are there either. I don't think I think you've articulated it so well. It's great that your parents gave you the bike and the skateboard. I grew up in Parramatta with my parents, and I wasn't allowed to have a skateboard or bike. I thought you were going to say you stole it. I would have stolen it if I didn't get one.
No,
Johnny Rock always had all the good stuff.
I'd go to the neighbours to have fun. It wasn't at my home, but But I think you're spot on. They do need to tackle some of these issues, and they're really challenging.